Next up is the Resources Browser panel, and this panel allows you to browse a folder that contains the standalone Maxwell material files, so the MXM files. And from this button you can choose the thumbnail size, and here you can browse to a different folder, for example, and you can see that it's going to create those thumbnails of the folders. From this button you can go back to the previous folder where you were, and if you want to use any of these materials you just simply drag and drop them into a scene or onto an object if we have an object in the scene. And when you do this you get two options, so either you can embed it in the scene or you can keep it as an MXM reference. So if I choose this option, you can see that now I can only update the material with maybe a different preview scene, but I'm not going to be able to edit anything. To edit it, you need to click either edit here or embed it into the scene, so it becomes part of your scene. It's no longer going to be referencing this standalone MXM file. So if I click edit, it's going to open MXZ, and from here I can make any changes, and when you're done with the changes you simply click this button here to save and close the material. But just keep in mind that MXZ and also Studio, they don't have any saving privileges usually on Windows because of Windows security to save files into the program files folder. So in that case it's not going to work with these materials that are in the path of the default install directory. So just keep that in mind if you try to make any changes and you see that nothing really changed, because you won't get any error messages. So in that case, simply embed the material, and now you can see that you can change anything you want. It's just part of the scene right now. So also in the resources browser, you'll notice you have a second tab here called Web. So this is the UI to reach the Maxwell Render MXM gallery. So it has about 3,500 free materials for you to use, and it's free for all licensed users. And the link to it, if you want to reach it via browser, is resources.maxwellrender.com. And also from here you can download the materials, unzip them, and then import them into your scene. But it's much faster to do this via Studio, or also I think most of the plugins also have this functionality. So I need to make a separate video about using the MXM gallery because there may be some issues sometimes with certain materials. When you download them, you'll get render errors, and I need to explain how to fix those with some of these downloaded materials. So for now, I'm just going to quickly give you an example. So if I search for a roof material, so these are all materials with the word roof in them, or a keyword that contains the word roof. And here you get a list of materials, and you can sort them by rating, by upload date, category, and if you double click the thumbnail here, you get a bigger thumbnail, so you can better view the material. And for example, this one looks nice. So if I just simply drag and drop it again, either in the material list panel or on an object, it just downloads the material, unzips it automatically, and asks you again, do you want to embed it in the scene or do you want to keep it as an MXM reference? Again, if I choose it to keep it as an MXM reference, the path to the material will be the path you set. If I open preferences and go to MXM gallery, it's going to be by default, I think this is the default, to be in the same folder as the project folder. But for now, because I haven't yet saved this MXS file, it doesn't have a project folder. So by default, then Studio simply downloads it into the temporary folder on your system. So just know that if I did have this MSS saved, it would have saved it in the project folder. Or you can uncheck this in preferences and specify a folder where you want these download MXM files to go. So again, I can also embed it into the scene, and I think this material, yes, this material, for example, it's okay because it found all the textures, but some of them it won't be able to find. So I need to make a separate video about that, how to fix these issues, and I'm not going to make it part of this UI video. So that's the resources browser and a quick look at the MXM gallery. Taking a look now at the scene tree panel, and this panel has three sections. The first one at the top holds the render options and the environment options. So you can see that when you click them, the attributes panel changes. You can also resize it from the bottom. The second section holds all the cameras in your scene, and here you can also right click and you have this menu with mostly self-explanatory options, and you can choose a new camera. You can double click a camera to make it the active one. And the section at the bottom holds all the groups and objects and groups of objects, and you can resize the columns here from the top. You can quickly hide or unhide objects or groups of objects from this little dot icon. You can also lock groups or objects, so in that case you won't be able to move them. And the third column here, the material column here obviously tells you which material is applied to that object. And if you see also a small icon here in this column, it means that that particular object is a multi-material object. So certain triangles of it contain a different material, or it can have many different materials applied to just a few triangles of it. So then you know that it is a multi-material object. And in that case, you'll only see the first material applied to it here, or applied to it as an object level. And to see the materials that are applied to the triangle groups, you click here in triangle group section in the attributes panel, and here you'll see listed all the triangle groups and their corresponding material. To quickly group and ungroup objects, you simply select them, right click, and choose either group or ungroup. So if I choose ungroup, now these objects have been ungrouped, and if I want to group them together, for example these two, I can select them with Shift or Control, right click and choose group and give the group a name. And now these have been grouped, and you can also drag and drop groups under groups. So there's a lot of flexibility on the hierarchy of your scene. You can also group actually groups under objects and objects under groups and so on. Now I'm not going to go through too much about working with objects and triangle selections, UVs and so on in Studio, because I don't want to make this tutorial too Studio centric, but I'll cover this in a special bonus video. So how to work with objects in Studio and triangle groups, UV maps and so on. So for now I'm just gonna keep it simple and let you know what this panel does, basically some functions you have. You can expand all, that can be practical, collapse all. You can select by keyword, and again you can use wildcards here to select groups or objects in your scene. One useful option, for example, if you click an object and you just want to see that object in the viewport, you can right click on it and choose invert selection. or directly from the viewport, right click selection, isolate selection. In that case, you will see only that object displayed in the viewport. Take care that if you click somewhere in the viewport, it's actually going to select another object, and then that isolate selection changes. And then to switch it off, simply right click again, selection, and uncheck isolate selection. Again, I don't want to make this tutorial series too studio centric, so I'll cover in more detail how to work with objects and groups and UVs and triangle groups and so on in a bonus video about Studio. For now, I think you have a pretty good understanding of what this panel does. It's not really that complicated. Next is the attributes panel with lots of stuff in it. So the first section here, coordinates, obviously that's the coordinates of your selection. And here again, you can, if you want to rescale it uniformly, just choose one and then press Shift, Enter, and that's gonna change all the triplets. Or you can Shift and use the mouse wheel to click and drag up and down, and that's gonna change it with the same values. And by the way, you can right click in any of these fields and choose the decimal precision. So if 3 decimals isn't enough, you can choose, I think, up to 5. Yes, 5. Center and reset. This has to do with the pivot of the object. So for example, you can choose to transform the pivot here. So if I click this button here to either transform the object or the pivot, here I'm just transforming the pivot, and then I click object again, and now if I rotate, obviously it's going to rotate from here. And if you want to recenter that pivot, just click this button, and it's going to take into account the bounding box to reset that the center of the object. And reset, that just resets the actual only the pivot to 0, 0, 0, so it's not actually changing the position of the object. Just keep that in mind. So you can click reset again and then just zero it out from here, so it's at 0. The next section, the appearance section, holds a few options on how the object is visible in the viewport and how it's going to be visible in the render. So it's quite important. The opacity here, this is actually, it's going to affect its opacity in the render. So you have a special opacity setting here, no matter which material is applied to this object. This is not important right now, and I think very few people use this. It's not really that important. Hidden from camera and shadow channel. So I'm going to go through these options in more detail when we start rendering stuff, but some of them are pretty self-explanatory, especially hidden from camera. So if you hide it from camera, then obviously, hopefully it's clear to you that, you know, the object will not be visible in the camera, but it will still influence the lighting in the scene. Again, I'm going to go through more details on these options. So moving on, we have the normals section here. So you can see that when you click on, when you check that on, you see these little green normals here, and you can click drag with the mouse wheel to make the normals bigger or smaller. And sometimes it's quite important to check the direction of the normals, because, for example, for the emitters, they're only going to emit light in the direction of the normals. So sometimes if you have an emitter in your scene and you want to, let's say, illuminate something here, and you apply an emitter material here, you're not going to see any light because all the light is going upwards. So in that case, that's the first thing to check, if the normals are pointing the right way. And if not, you can simply flip the normals and everything will be fine. So I uncheck that. The smoothing, this has to do with the smoothing object between polygons, and I have to explain that when we start rendering stuff. And it's really not appropriate to show what it does right now in this UI video. So moving on, the shading mode. Here you can control the shading mode per object, and it's going to override the shading mode in the viewport. So this only has to do with the shading in the viewport, not in the render. So for example, if you have the viewport set to texture decal, and imagine you have a very complex scene with lots of geometry, that's going to slow down your viewport speed depending on your graphics card. So in that case, you can choose certain objects and choose for them to only be shown in bounding box, in which case the viewport refresh will be much faster and it overrides whatever shading mode you have for the viewport itself. So that can be quite useful sometimes. And if you want the viewport to always be taken into account, then just set this to the highest shading mode, which is textured blend. And in that case, then it's the viewport that's going to be taken into account for the object again. The object ID color, this has to do with channels, rendering channels. So I'm going to talk about that in a later lesson. Also the backface material that's applied to this object. So in Maxwell, you can have, even for geometry that is single-sided, so a single-sided polygon, it can have two materials, one for the front face and one for the back face. And in that case, you can see it here. Or you can also choose it by clicking this icon and choosing it from the list of materials in your scene. The Boolean option, again, this is a render time option, and I'm going to discuss that in later lessons, as well as the blocked emitters. So yeah, quite a few parameters here we'll be going through in later lessons, but the most useful ones for this purpose, for this video, I mean, is the shading mode here and the normals. The UV sets have to do with the obviously the UV sets of the object. If you don't know what UV sets are, I'm going to talk about that in later lessons when we have to do with texturing. But here you can rename, delete, add UVs to the object. And also if you click here the UV selection button, you can move around the object's UVs. But again, I'm going to talk about all this in that bonus video I mentioned. So those are the UV sets. The triangle groups, again, these are all the triangle groups that the object contains. So just to quickly show you, if I switch to triangle selection mode, I select the object, and now I can select triangles of this object. If I think I should be in the right, pointing in the right direction, yes, because the normals were pointing downwards. So for example, if I select just one triangle, and to create a group of it, I can right click the object and choose object group triangles. And now you can see it appear here. So now I can give it a custom. So I'm just going through this very quickly just to give you an idea how it works. And this one, I'm going to make it blue and apply that to the object. You can see now in Fire that this object has those two materials applied to it. The blue one applied to it on an object level, and then the triangle, any material applied at triangle group level will override the material that's applied at object level. And here again, rename, remove, merge. So if you have several triangle groups, you can select them, and it will merge those triangle groups together. The last section of the attributes panel is the modifiers panel. So these are like special plugins that Maxwell Render has that extend its functionality, and they're applied on an object, so they're object modifiers. And to apply one to an object, you select the object and either select one from the list here or right click the object apply object modifier extension and choose it here. So I guess the most famous one is Maxwell Grass. So if I click that, you can see that it's added to the list, and right now it's upside down because the normals of the plane were pointing downwards. So I can just I can rotate that 180 degrees. And you can have several modifiers on the same object. You can turn modifiers on and off, so you don't necessarily need to delete them just to see what they do. So that's nice. And then you can also remove them with this button here. And sometimes if they don't refresh in the viewport, then just click the refresh button here to force a viewport refresh of any changes you may have made to these parameters. Moving on to the viewport panel. So of course you can also click and drag on the viewport title bar, and you can move it wherever you like. You can also move it to a secondary monitor if you want, and you can have as many viewports open at the same time as you like. One keyboard shortcut I use all the time with the viewport is the H key. H as in Harold. So if you press H, you'll see that all the other panels minimize, and you can see your scene really big in a nice big viewport. And then press H again to bring the panels back. The first drop down lets you choose either perspective view. So there's always a default perspective view, which allows you to see your camera. For example, if you want to control the camera this way. And then you can also, here you have a list of cameras in your scene to make those active, or just simply double click from the camera list here. So if you're in perspective view, for example, and you have a certain view, then you choose new camera, then that's going to be the position of your new camera from that perspective view. Or in fact, whatever view you were in, because if you are in a camera view and then you choose to make a new camera, then that's going to be in the exact same position as the old camera. I'll delete those. The second drop down lets you change the shading mode of the viewport. And I know for many people that have gaming graphics cards, if you switch it to wireframe, usually it's going to be slower than shaded view, which tends to be very fast along with texture decal. And also hidden line tends to be much slower than shaded view. So just keep that in mind if you get a very slow viewport. The third drop down lets you turn on and off certain things. So for example, if I have physical sky on and I press the K key, here you can see the shortcut, you can get a preview of what the physical sky is going to be exposed as with these particular camera settings. It actually gives you a pretty good estimation of what it's going to look like in the render. So if I change some settings to make it darker, you can see that the sky preview also updates. And again, K key to turn that off. Here you have a few viewports, orthographic viewports, so top, left, right, top, down, bottom, and so on. And keep in mind that if you use the orthographic viewports, then the grid is always going to be in an adaptive grid. So again, press 3D to switch to the normal 3D viewport. And that's pretty much it for the viewport in this UI video. Well, I'll just mention quickly some things you can do to speed up the viewport. So if you go into Preferences, Viewport Rendering, you can switch off Smooth Anti-Aliasing. and that can have a pretty big impact on the viewport speed. And also, if you have any problems with the viewport, try to switch off vertex buffers and then restart Studio to see if that fixes the problem. One more panel I'll mention, which can be quite useful sometimes, and that's the console panel. So I'll switch it on. And it gives you messages about the scene, and for example here it says it loaded the scene successfully, and it can be quite useful. For example, if you press the render button and you just get a message that I couldn't render the scene or I couldn't export the scene, then check in the console panel to see what the problem is, because usually it's a silly problem like it couldn't find a certain texture, or you don't have any lights in your scene. So in that case, Maxwell will tell you that unless you want a black looking render, add at least one emitter in your scene. I'll mention quickly these nice looking buttons here, which you'll probably use most of the time. So render obviously exports your scene to a temporary MXS file and sends it to Maxwell for rendering. The second button is actually a new function in version 3. And this is just a simple tool to let you animate certain things in your scene. So Maxwell Studio is obviously not an animation package, but sometimes you may wish to only have let's say a simple turntable animation of your design. So you can do that by either, for example, animating the camera, animating an object in your scene. So here you can choose the object, how much you want it to rotate, on which axis it should rotate, direction, ease in, ease out, and motion blur. So really, I'm not going to go through this panel in detail because most of this is very self-explanatory. I just simply suggest to always have motion blur on because it's going to look a lot better and more realistic. And also one cool thing is you can animate the environment, so you can do like a time-lapse thing, animation where the sun quickly moves across the sky, and also the environment and sun can be separately animated. Next up is this button, which lets you send your scene to render via network, so that can be useful and speed up your workflow a bit. The fourth button is to render a viewport, so you simply click on it and it will render the active viewport, meaning the last viewport that you clicked in. So it's going to render using the production render engine, so the real render engine, so to speak. And to stop the render, you simply just click in the viewport. And the final button is fire, which will set fire to your computer. Well, hopefully not, but if you bad joke. If you click it, you'll see the fire preview engine, so the fast interactive render engine. And it's actually not a separate render engine, it's just a tweaked version of the production render. And it just sort of prioritizes the easy lighting calculations first, so that it gives you usually a very quick preview of what your scene is going to look like. But again, the fire engine or the draft render engine, it's not so good if you render a lot of transparent objects that have caustics or subsurface scattering materials. In that case, it's actually going to be slower to be noise free than the production render engine. But you can see in this case it gave me a very good idea of what the final render is going to look like very, very quickly. And also Fire supports all the functionality and all the materials of the production render engine, so you don't have to do two separate types of materials for these two different versions of Maxwell Render. So that's really useful. And I'm going to talk about Fire in more detail in a separate video. So you can see how quickly you can use it for look development, and also you can actually use it to render your final render with if you wish. Or an animation, you can render it very quickly using Fire to have a preview of what that animation will look like.